Dave, what are some of the best ways to protect our plants from the cold weather that, although it has been a little bit warmer, I hear the cold weather could be coming back, but it's certainly not looking too good out there at the moment.
I understand there's snow sort of beckoning its way into Scotland at this particular moment, apparently. Some 2 to 4 centimetres. I'm thinking, please don't come any further south, thank you very much. But I think the most important thing is that you need to insulate at ground level, as well as in the greenhouse, of course, with bubble wrap or sacking or what have you, if of course you do have a greenhouse. But a cold frame, which is quite easily made, actually will help to protect your plants that you may have wanted to overwinter somewhere. One of those things which allotmenteers tend to use quite a lot are these very large boxes, plastic boxes, these containers that you put all kinds of manner of things like biscuits, books and children's toys. A lot of those are good windproofing actually, so they're also a good way of insulating your plants. This year, and I'm laughing because the rain is fairly pelting down outside. It's quite remarkable. But this year so far we've seen one of the longest, coldest, possibly the wettest winters we've had for a long time. And those more tender plants that were too big to dig up or move to a warmer place would have benefited last autumn, early winter, from covering the ground with a mulch of straw or leaves, which should still be there, of course. So you're now going to have to think about removing that in the near future, depending, of course, of whether it actually maintains this weather increase, or this temperature increase. Tender plants' top growth should also have been tied up and covered with straw, bubble wrap, sacking, fleece, all of those kinds of things, which are handy, and that'll protect them from those damaging frosts and those nasty icy winds that we've actually had throughout this winter. What you need to do, of course, is to check to make sure that they're not rotting inside, or give them some chance, or get some air back into the inside of that particular plant. Those plants that you could have removed to a safer place will have benefited from the protection of being brought indoors, placed in a greenhouse, for instance, or the cold frame, or even, as I say, those large plastic boxes, which will help considerably cut down the amount of wind that's getting across the leaf. Each late autumn, we, for instance, in our family, we bring into the conservatory 2 small lemon plants. Not only does that protect them from the winter, although lemons or citrus fruit will actually survive a temperature of something like -5, but I wouldn't want to take the chance because they're my wife's plants. But not only does it protect them from the winter, but they carry on flowering, which gives us a wonderful scent throughout the winter, and we can actually see the lemons, albeit they're quite small at the moment, but it will continue to grow because it benefits from the warmth that you're giving it throughout the winter. So insulation, prime mover.
Now, Dave, in our garden, the cold weather's affected some plants I don't think have ever been affected before. So how is the cold weather been affecting plants?
Good question, actually. We've all heard over the past few months how this winter's affected us and the plants, and animal life for that matter as well, just to digress very quickly, because it's meant that there has been a proper hibernation period for things like hedgehogs and those animals which do actually hibernate, so it's been good for them in that sense. But for our plant life, it's been sort of much later. You've only got to look at the island's roadsides. For instance, travelling up here tonight or travelling to Sheerness, so many daffodils and so many narcissi. For example, you just see how late they are coming
really
into bloom.
This week, really, it seems.
It literally is that, isn't it? But basically, every time I've driven off the island or driven to Sheerness, I've said the same thing, or my wife has actually commented. The flowers aren't out yet. When do I see a bit of yellow? Put it that way. Many trees still aren't showing. That green hue, sometimes you can drive past, you think, they're sprouting. It's here. It's finally arrived. That shows when the leaves are budding, basically. About the only plants that have come into full flower very recently, and again I've seen them on the travelling up to Chatham a couple of days this week, are early yellow forsythias. At last the forsythias are out. They're heralds of spring, if you know what I mean. Viburnum is one other which I've actually got in my garden, which is just showing through, little dots of white over the place. It's a very welcome sight indeed, but this long, cold, wet spell's put back many tasks in the gardens as well, on allotment plots. Things that should have been done in late January, February, for instance, are now only just being started. Spring pruning of established perennial plants, trees, shrubs, flowers, roses. My wife has only cut them very recently in this sort of hybrid period that we've had where the temperature's actually just touched double figures. last couple of weeks, or last week or so, isn't it? Hardy fuchsias, pruning of those, for instance. Ornamental grasses, cutting those back. Flowering shoots, or old flowered shoots of winter jasmine, that kind of thing. I've only just managed to get some of that out, and thinned out. Cut summer flowering clematis, for instance, back to the live wood. Again, only just starting. You could say there's a positive side to it, because people are just starting to sow seeds and protecting them still from the cold, and keeping them inside, protecting them from the cold, putting them in cold storage. Clear away, for instance, those kinds of things which have formed last year's debris. There's an awful lot of it about, simply because everything has got later and later. Yeah. So inevitably you've put it off and put it off, simply for very good reasons. You can't get into the garden. We've had so much snow, ice, water, rain, that kind of thing. Pot up those plants that need to be moved on to a bigger pot. Because of the lateness of the season, for instance, many allotmenteers are now only talking about sowing their vegetable seeds. Last Sunday, or yesterday, for instance, it was a case of, have you planted your tomato seeds yet? Have your peas and your beans gone in? That kind of thing. Whereas normally we were saying ours are, 2 or 3 inches high, or I did mine a couple of weeks ago. Those staples that you would normally see on any allotment or in any garden, for instance, they're still pretty late. Everything seems to be on a what you might call a catch-up basis. Some veg has come through a little since the onset of last fortnight's milder weather, dare I call it, despite the rain that we've still got outside here. Autumn sown broad beans, for instance, they're about 3 or 4 inches high and starting to get away. Garlic bulbs, about the only success I've actually got on my allotment at the moment. They're quite heavy. They're quite high, but then garlic needs a cold period anyway. Winter onions. But things like weeding. Weeds, how is it? It's a good question. How is it weeds always manage to come through the winter unscathed? And they are gathering apace. And I look at my allotment, I looked at it yesterday and thought, where did you all come from last week? But so you can see it's a catch-up time in the garden.
Dave, what plants are particularly ideal to plant this time of year?
I suppose you could say it's this time of the year to get those bare-rooted bushes in before the buds really do break out, and the weather warms up too much. Now, I know, having said earlier that we've had some good weather or good temperatures for the last couple of weeks, you really do need to get the bare-rooted stuff in there right at the moment. Equally, if you have a later flowering bush or plant that needs moving, this is the time to actually do it. You know, I wouldn't hold off for very much longer if you can actually get out into the garden, get those slips in, get those small bushes in, and move the ones that you actually feel really do need to be moved, or those which are in the wrong position. I'd keep any of the spring or the half-hardy annuals covered and protected for a couple of weeks yet, not least because of the rain that we've suffered out there tonight. Rain, as we know, will damage leaf, what have you. So as much as you can do to protect those more tender plants that haven't really got established as yet. Many perennials are only just starting to show their heads above the ground. For instance, again in my garden, I have some fritillaries, snakehead fritillaries, which are about 2 or 3 inches above the ground. Normally they would be coming into bloom by about now. Muscari, the little grape hyacinth, a nice little purple flower that looks like a miniature bunch of grapes. For instance, they are very, very much behind what they should normally be at this time of the year. So there are early sort of flowering plants which would be established and showing their heads by now. Again, on the vegetable side, I'd leave for a week or so yet, or a couple of weeks same reason, possible cold and wet. Those plants which you would normally have out trying to gather as much sun as yet, because it's still quite cold out there. So protection. Cold and wet results a miserable gardener as well. There's nothing worse than actually trying to garden with your knees up to muck and mud, and you're thinking, why on earth did I start this particular job? So cold and wet result a miserable gardener, and of course inevitably a poor plant in that sense. Let the soil warm up a bit. Funnily enough, I was on the plot yesterday morning and put my hands into part of the allotment, and I thought, my word, this is extremely warm. But the thing is, at the moment, it's merely transitory.
Yeah.
It's not consistently warm. For instance, it would have got much colder today because of the rain and the clouds that we've actually had. So let the soil warm up in the long run with a bit more patience, and planting will benefit hugely, and it'll allow your plants to get away that much quicker when the sun does and the warmth does actually arrive.